The flash of cameras broke the silence first. Then came the questions shouted across the makeshift briefing room inside the Allied command bunker. Reporters crowded forward, pencils poised, as General Winston Harris pulled the heavy canvas sheet away from what appeared to be an ordinary military rubber raft. The assembled press corps fell suddenly quiet, their initial disappointment evident as they stared at what seemed nothing more extraordinary than standard river-crossing equipment. Then the general smiled slightly, running his weathered hand along the gray-green surface. "Gentlemen, this is how we fooled the entire German High Command," he announced, his voice echoing against the concrete walls. "This is how we made them believe an entire armored division was crossing the Seine when in fact it was nothing but rubber, canvas, and air." The correspondents leaned forward now, their interest rekindled as they began to understand the significance of what they were seeing. It was June 1945, almost exactly 1 year after D-Day, and the full story of one of the war's most elaborate deceptions was finally being revealed to the public. The journalists scribbled furiously, already composing headlines in their minds about phantom bridges that had helped win a war. What none of them realized was that the true story began not with generals or strategic planning meetings, but with a former Broadway set designer from Brooklyn who had never fired a shot in anger. Lieutenant Daniel Schwartzman sat alone in his workshop on that gray March morning in 1944, surrounded by what looked like children's toys rather than weapons of war. Miniature tanks, rubber boats, canvas sheets, and inflatable pontoons covered every available surface. His fingers, once accustomed to the delicate work of theatrical lighting design, now manipulated models of war machinery with practiced precision. Daniel had been recruited into a unit so secret that most of the Allied High Command didn't know it existed. They called themselves the Ghost Army, though officially they were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Their mission was deception on a scale never before attempted in modern warfare. To make the enemy see battalions where there were none, to hear armies that didn't exist, and to believe in bridges that couldn't hold a single real tank. As he tested the tensile strength of a new rubber compound, Daniel wondered if the Germans would really believe that these inflatable decoys represented actual American military might. Would the enemy fall for bridges made of rubber and canvas stretched across one of Europe's mightiest rivers? How could something so fundamentally absurd become a cornerstone of Allied strategy? The questions troubled him as he worked, measuring and cutting, his mind wandering to the real soldiers who would depend on this elaborate charade. What would happen when the Germans realized they had been tracking shadows instead of substance, chasing echoes rather than armies? The morning light faded as clouds gathered outside the converted barn in southern England where Daniel and his team worked in secrecy. Rain began to patter against the windows, a fitting soundtrack to the doubt that occasionally crept into his mind. Would these fake bridges truly save lives, or simply add another bizarre footnote to this already incomprehensible war? Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Simmons appeared in the doorway, shaking raindrops from his coat and surveying the workshop with weary eyes. "How's our phantom bridge coming along, Schwartzman? The brass wants an update." Daniel gestured to the scale model before him, a Seine crossing, complete with miniature rubber pontoons and canvas-covered frameworks designed to mimic the silhouette of heavy engineering equipment. "It's coming along, sir. The new material holds shape better, even under searchlights. From 500 yards, even in daylight, it'll look like the real thing." Simmons nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "That's what they said about those inflatable Sherman tanks last month. Then the wind kicked up during testing, and half of them were floating across the field like balloons at a county fair." Daniel couldn't help but smile at the memory. "We've solved that problem, sir. Better anchor points, heavier bases. These bridges won't blow away unless there's a hurricane." "Good," Simmons replied, his voice softening slightly. "Because if they do, it won't be rubber tanks flying around. It'll be real men dying because the Germans figured out where our actual crossings are happening." The colonel's words hung in the air as he departed, leaving Daniel alone with his creations once more. The rain intensified outside, drumming a martial beat against the roof. The lieutenant returned to his work with renewed focus, his hands moving with the precision that had once crafted illusions for Broadway audiences. Only now, the stakes were measured not in ticket sales, but in human lives. What would the Germans see when they looked across the Seine in the coming months? Would they perceive bridges packed with armor, convoys of supplies, the unmistakable signs of an Allied advance? Or would they see through the deception, recognizing rubber and canvas for what they truly were? The answer would determine the fate of thousands of soldiers still waiting to cross the real bridges that would lead them deeper into occupied France. As March gave way to April, the preparations intensified. In a secluded field outside London, the first full-scale tests of the Phantom Bridges began under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. Captain Michael Westley, a former engineer from Chicago who had joined the Ghost Army after being wounded at Kasserine Pass, supervised the assembly with meticulous attention to detail. "Faster, gentlemen," he called to the team of specially trained soldiers struggling with the heavy rubber pontoons. "The Germans won't politely wait while you figure out which end is which. In the field, you'll have 90 minutes, maximum, before their reconnaissance aircraft spot you." Daniel watched from the sideline, clipboard in hand, noting how the elaborate deception took shape. The inflatable bridges themselves were only part of the illusion. Equally important were the fake supply trucks, the canvas-covered engineering equipment, and the dozen other details that would convince enemy observers they were witnessing a major river crossing operation. From a distance of 200 yards, even Daniel found himself momentarily convinced by the sight. The rubber pontoons, once inflated, mimicked their steel counterparts with uncanny accuracy. The canvas coverings, painted to simulate heavy machinery, cast shadows that appeared authentic from above. Most impressive were the inflatable tanks waiting at the bridge approaches. From the air, they would appear as a column of armor preparing to cross. Sergeant James Cooper, a former movie set painter from California, approached Daniel with a wry smile. "Looks pretty convincing from here, doesn't it? I keep expecting real tanks to start rolling across." "That's the idea," Daniel replied. "But the real question is how it'll look through German binoculars at dawn, or through the viewfinder of a reconnaissance plane." Cooper nodded, his expression growing more serious. "You know what keeps me up at night? Not whether they'll believe the bridges are real. It's whether they'll waste their bombs and shells on our fakes instead of finding the real crossings." Daniel had considered this question many times. The Ghost Army's mission was twofold. Not only to create convincing decoys, but to make them attractive enough targets that the Germans would direct their limited resources toward attacking them. If they bomb our rubber, they're not bombing our boys. That's the whole point. "Still feels strange," Cooper admitted. "Making art that's designed to be destroyed." Daniel understood the sentiment. His Broadway sets had been crafted to last for months of performances, to be admired night after night. These elaborate deceptions, in contrast, served their purpose best when they drew enemy fire, when they were targeted for destruction. It represented a profound inversion of everything he had previously understood about his craft. The test concluded successfully. The entire Phantom Bridge dismantled and packed away in under 40 minutes. Colonel Simmons appeared satisfied, though, as always, his praise was restrained. "Good work, gentlemen. Next week we move to Phase 2. Nighttime assembly and sound effects." That evening, in the officers' mess, conversation turned to the impending invasion that everyone knew was coming, but no one discussed directly. Lieutenant William Porter, an intelligence officer attached to the Ghost Army, leaned across the table toward Daniel. "Word is your bridges will be part of the big push. After the initial landings, when we need to convince them we're going one way while actually going another." Daniel nodded cautiously, aware of the classified nature of such discussions. "If they're used at all, they need to be perfect. The Germans aren't fools." "No," Porter agreed, "but they are desperate. Desperate men tend to see what they fear most. Right now, they fear Allied armor crossing the Seine at multiple points. Your rubber toys play right into that fear." After dinner, walking back to his quarters under a sky filled with stars, Daniel found himself wondering about the German officers who would soon be studying these deceptions through their field glasses. Were they so different from the American commanders who would be studying real bridge crossings? Both would be looking for the same signs, the same patterns, reading the same tactical language of war. The difference was that one side would be reading a fiction crafted by men like himself, artists, designers, and craftsmen who had turned their creative talents to deception. It was, in its way, the ultimate theater production, with all of Europe as the stage and the highest possible stakes. As he fell asleep that night, Daniel's dreams were filled with bridges that stretched across impossible distances, bridges that disappeared when approached, bridges that somehow carried the weight of armies despite being made of nothing more substantial than rubber and hope. What would the Germans do when they discovered the deception? Would they admire the craftsmanship, the attention to detail? Or would they respond with the cold fury of those who had been fooled at a critical moment? The answer would come sooner than any of them expected, as spring advanced and the date of the invasion drew nearer with each passing day. May brought unseasonably warm weather to southern England, and with it came the final preparations for Operation Overlord. The Ghost Army's role had been confirmed. They would deploy their phantom bridges across the Seine in the weeks following the initial landings, creating the impression of Allied crossings at multiple points to confuse German defensive positioning. Private First Class Thomas Jenkins, a former construction worker from Detroit, wiped sweat from his brow as he helped load the disassembled components of the fake bridges onto transport trucks. "Never thought I'd be packing rubber instead of laying concrete," he remarked to Daniel, who was supervising the loading. "Concrete bridges take months to build," Daniel replied. "Ours go up in hours. That's the advantage." Jenkins nodded, though his expression remained dubious. "Sure, but concrete bridges don't deflate if you poke 'em with a sharp stick." "That's why we're counting on the Germans not getting close enough to poke them," Daniel said, checking another component off his inventory list. Nearby, other elements of the Ghost Army prepared their own specialized equipment. The sound team, led by Major Richard Thornton, tested massive speakers capable of broadcasting the recorded noises of bridge construction and heavy vehicle movement over distances of several miles. The radio team practiced transmitting false communications that would support the illusion of major troop movements. "The bridges are just one piece of the puzzle," Major Thornton explained to a group of new arrivals. "The Germans won't just be seeing them. They'll be hearing construction crews working through the night, listening to radio traffic about supply convoys, even smelling diesel exhaust from generators will position near the sites. It's a full sensory deception." One of the newcomers, a young lieutenant fresh from officer training, raised his hand. "Sir, what happens if they actually try to bomb these fake bridges?" Thornton smiled. "Then we've succeeded, Lieutenant. Every bomb dropped on rubber is one that isn't hitting a real bridge with real soldiers crossing it." The question highlighted the peculiar nature of their mission. Most military units measured success by objectives secured, enemy forces defeated, territory gained. The Ghost Army, in contrast, succeeded when they drew fire, when they became the target, when the enemy expended resources attacking what amounted to elaborate stage props. Daniel often thought about how to explain this to his parents back in Brooklyn if he ever got the chance. His father, who had fought in the previous war, understood combat in conventional terms: holding ground, taking hills, defeating the enemy directly. How would he comprehend a son who fought by creating illusions, who considered it a victory when his creations were destroyed? As the loading continued throughout the day, Daniel found himself checking and rechecking the equipment with increasing attention to detail. Each inflatable pontoon, each section of canvas, each pump and valve could mean the difference between a convincing deception and a failed one. And a failed deception meant exposed troops, vulnerable real bridges, and ultimately more casualties. That night, the officers of the Ghost Army gathered for a final briefing. Colonel Simmons stood before a map of northern France, key crossing points along the Seine marked in red. "Gentlemen, in approximately 3 weeks, assuming the initial landings succeed, your phantom bridges will be deployed here, here, and here." He indicated several points along the river. "Meanwhile, real engineering battalions will be constructing actual crossings at these locations." He pointed to different spots, separated by significant distances. "The objective is to create sufficient confusion that the Germans cannot concentrate their forces effectively. They must believe we are crossing at multiple points simultaneously, stretching their already depleted resources to the breaking point." The room was silent as the implications sank in. Daniel studied the map, calculating distances, imagining how the deception would unfold from the German perspective. Would they dispatch reconnaissance planes to all suspected crossing points? Would they divide their remaining armor and artillery to cover multiple approaches? Or would they see through the deception immediately? Colonel Simmons continued, his voice dropping slightly. I don't need to tell you that what we're attempting has never been done before on this scale. There is no precedent, no manual, no established doctrine for what the 23rd is about to undertake. You will be writing this chapter of military history yourselves. As the meeting concluded and the officers dispersed into the warm May evening, Daniel found himself walking alongside Captain Westley. Do you think it will work? He asked quietly. Westley considered the question carefully before answering. The bridges themselves will work. I'm confident of that. Whether the Germans believe them, whether they react as we hope they will, he shrugged, that's beyond our control. All we can do is create the most convincing illusion possible and trust that their preconceptions do the rest. It was, Daniel realized, not so different from theater after all. On Broadway, the success of an illusion depended not just on the quality of the set design, but on the audience's willingness to be transported, to believe in the world created before them. The Germans would be an involuntary audience to this performance, but the principle remained the same. The deception worked best when it aligned with what the viewer already expected or feared to see. As June approached and final preparations for D-Day accelerated across southern England, Daniel found himself wondering about the German soldiers who would soon be peering across the Seine, squinting through binoculars at what they believed to be American engineering operations. Would they be veterans, experienced enough to spot inconsistencies? Or would they be the increasingly young, inexperienced troops that intelligence reported were now filling the German ranks? The success of their phantom bridges might depend on who was watching from the other side. Dawn broke over the Seine Valley on June 20th, 1944, 2 weeks after Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy. The river flowed placidly, its surface catching the first golden rays of sunlight. Along the northern bank, in a section carefully chosen for its visibility from German observation posts, 30 men of the Ghost Army worked with quiet efficiency in the gray half-light. Master Sergeant Frank Mulroney, a former stagehand from Chicago's theater district, directed the operation with hand signals, keeping verbal communications to a minimum. The inflatable pontoons took shape rapidly, their rubber surfaces expanding with soft hissing sounds as air compressors worked at muffled capacity. "Careful with that section," he whispered urgently as 2 soldiers struggled with a particularly unwieldy piece. "If it tears, we're finished before we start." Daniel moved among the men, checking connections, ensuring the deception would hold up under scrutiny. From the southern bank, where German forces maintained observation posts, the scene would appear to be a standard military bridge construction operation. The canvas screens erected to conceal the work were deliberately inadequate, allowing tantalizing glimpses of the activity behind them. By mid-morning, the Phantom Bridge stretched across the Seine, a perfect visual replica of a military pontoon crossing. Inflatable tanks and trucks were positioned at strategic points, some appearing to wait their turn to cross, others seemingly in the process of traversing the bridge. From a distance, the illusion was virtually perfect. "Now we wait," Captain Westley said quietly, joining Daniel behind a screen of trees several hundred yards back from the riverbank. "Sound team begins in 30 minutes. Radio transmissions have already started." Daniel nodded, raising his binoculars to study their creation from the perspective the Germans would have. "It looks real even knowing it's fake. The shadows are convincing, the scale is perfect." What the Germans couldn't see were the submerged cables anchoring the rubber pontoons to prevent them from being carried downstream by the current. They couldn't detect the carefully concealed air compressors maintaining pressure in the inflatable components. And they certainly couldn't tell that the soldiers visible on the bridge were wooden cutouts with uniforms draped over them, positioned to create the impression of engineering troops at work. At precisely 1000 hours, the sound team activated their equipment. From carefully hidden positions, massive speakers began broadcasting the recorded noise of heavy machinery, shouted orders, and the unmistakable rumble of tank engines. The audio had been captured during actual bridge construction exercises back in England, then edited to create a continuous soundtrack of military engineering activity. "Listen," Wesley said with a slight smile, "you can hear the difference between a bulldozer and a crane in there. That's attention to detail." The deception was complete. To any German observer, the scene would present all the expected sights and sounds of a major river crossing operation. Intelligence reports had confirmed that German aerial reconnaissance capability in this sector was severely limited due to Allied air superiority, meaning their observation would likely be restricted to what could be seen and heard from their positions on the southern bank. The wait for German reaction was excruciating. Minutes stretched into hours as the Ghost Army maintained their phantom bridge, adjusting positions, keeping the illusion alive. Daniel found himself wondering if perhaps they had miscalculated, if the Germans had already abandoned this sector, or were simply uninterested in what appeared to be happening across the river. Then, at 14:33, the first shell screamed overhead. "They've taken the bait," Wesley announced calmly as the projectile exploded in the water approximately 50 yards from the fake bridge. Right on schedule. More artillery fire followed, the German gunners adjusting their aim with each salvo. Some shells landed dangerously close to the phantom structure, sending plumes of water skyward. A direct hit would reveal the deception instantly. Rubber and canvas would shred under the impact, the inflatable components would collapse, and the entire operation would be compromised. Sergeant Mulroney organized teams to make rapid repairs as needed, patching small punctures and reinflating sections that lost pressure. The men worked with remarkable composure, considering they were now under active artillery fire. "Remember, every shell they waste here is one that isn't hitting our real boys crossing downstream," Mulroney reminded his nervous troops as they crouched behind earthen berms between repair runs. Private Jenkins, who had expressed skepticism about the rubber bridges back in England, now found himself sprinting to patch a deflating pontoon section near the center of the river. "Never thought I'd be risking my neck to save a rubber ducky," he muttered as he worked, applying a specialized adhesive patch to seal a small tear caused by shrapnel. By dusk, the German artillery had expended over 300 rounds targeting the Phantom Bridge, yet remarkably, it remained largely intact. Minor damage had been quickly repaired, and from the southern bank, it would still appear to be a functioning military crossing. More significantly, radio intercepts confirmed that German headquarters had diverted a reserve panzer battalion to counter the apparent river crossing in this sector, tanks and men that would not be available to oppose the actual Allied bridgehead being established 17 miles downstream. As darkness fell, the Ghost Army continued its performance. Powerful lights were occasionally switched on and off, simulating the controlled blackouts of a real engineering operation continuing through the night. The sound team adjusted their audio tracks to reflect nighttime construction activity, more shouted commands, the clanking of equipment, occasional engine revs. Daniel, finally able to rest after nearly 20 hours of continuous tension, sat with his back against a tree several hundred yards from the riverbank. The distant thump of artillery continued sporadically as German guns fired blindly at the phantom crossing under cover of darkness. "We're actually doing it," he said quietly to Captain Wesley, who had joined him. "We're fooling the entire German army with rubber and recorded sound." "Not the entire German army," Wesley corrected, though his tone was light. "Just this sector. But yes, it appears to be working exactly as intended." Daniel watched as flares occasionally lit the night sky, German attempts to illuminate the bridge for better targeting. Each brief flash of light revealed their creation still spanning the river, still carrying the silhouettes of vehicles and troops, still drawing enemy fire away from the real operations elsewhere. "It's strange," he reflected. "Back on Broadway, success meant the audience never noticed my work. The best set design is invisible. It supports the story without drawing attention to itself. Here, success means becoming the center of attention, drawing all eyes and fire toward us." "Different kind of theater," Wesley agreed, "but the principle is the same. We're telling a story, creating a world for the audience to believe in. The difference is just that our audience is wearing field gray instead of evening wear, and they're holding artillery coordinates instead of opera glasses. As the night deepened around them, both men fell silent, listening to the distant explosions and the nearer sounds of their phantom bridge creaking realistically in the gentle river current. Somewhere across that same river, German officers were surely studying maps, revising defense plans, issuing orders based on what they believed they were witnessing. How long would the deception hold? Would daylight reveal flaws that darkness had concealed? And what would happen when the Germans eventually realized they had been fooled? That they had committed precious resources to countering an invasion force made of nothing more substantial than air? The answers would come with the new day, as the sun rose again over the rubber bridges that looked packed with armor but couldn't support the weight of a single real tank. The second day of the deception dawned with a thick mist rising from the Seine, providing an unexpected natural screen that enhanced the illusion. Through the swirling vapor, the phantom bridge appeared even more convincing. Its outline softened, its artificial nature less detectable. Lieutenant Colonel Simmons arrived at the forward observation post shortly after sunrise, accompanied by 2 intelligence officers eager to assess the operation's impact. Overnight radio intercepts confirm complete success, one of the officers announced, spreading a decoded message on the hood of a jeep. German 7th Army headquarters is convinced we're establishing a major crossing here. They've ordered the 221st Infantry Division to counterattack as soon as the mist clears. Daniel, who had managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful sleep, felt a curious mixture of pride and apprehension. The deception was working even better than anticipated, but success brought its own dangers. If they launch a serious counterattack, they'll discover it's all fake within minutes. Colonel Simmons nodded. That's been considered. 9th Air Force has fighters on standby to intervene if the Germans attempt a major ground assault. Their mission is to disrupt the attack before they reach the riverbank. The mist began to thin as the morning advanced, revealing their phantom creation still stretching across the water. Overnight, the repair crews had worked continuously, patching holes and maintaining air pressure in the inflatable components. From the German perspective, it would appear that despite their artillery bombardment, the American engineering troops had succeeded in completing and maintaining the bridge. Captain Westley approached, his uniform damp with mist and river water. "We've adjusted the visual," he reported, "added more traffic crossing the bridge. From their observation posts, it'll look like we've started moving armor across during the night." Indeed, the bridge now appeared to be carrying a steady stream of vehicles, all inflatable mock-ups or canvas-covered wooden frames shaped to mimic tanks and trucks. The Ghost Army's artists had carefully positioned these decoys to simulate the flow of a major armored column beginning to establish itself on the southern bank. At approximately 1000 hours, the expected German response began. First came intensified artillery fire, more precisely targeted than the previous day's salvos. Then, aerial recognition confirmed movement from German mechanized units. The counterattack was being mounted. "They're committing significant forces," the intelligence officer noted, studying reports from aerial reconnaissance. Estimates suggest at least a battalion of infantry supported by whatever armor they could scrape together, perhaps 15 to 20 tanks. Colonel Simmons immediately radioed for the prearranged air support. The Phantom Bridge had done its job, drawing German attention and resources, but now the deception needed protection to remain credible. Within minutes, the distinctive roar of P-47 Thunderbolts filled the sky as American fighter bombers swept in, targeting the advancing German column while still several miles from the river. The sight was both terrible and exhilarating. The power of Allied air superiority demonstrated in devastating fashion as bombs fell among the German vehicles. "Poor bastards," Sergeant Mulroney muttered, watching through binoculars as plumes of smoke rose from the German positions. "They're dying because they believe our bridge is real." The observation silenced conversation in the command post. It was one thing to create a deception that drew enemy fire away from real troops. It was another to witness men dying because they had been convinced by your illusion. The moral complexity of their mission had never been more apparent. The German attack faltered under the aerial assault, their forces scattering to find cover. Those that continued forward met withering fire from Allied artillery batteries positioned specifically to protect the Phantom operation. By mid-afternoon, German radio traffic indicated a withdrawal to defensive positions. The counterattack had been abandoned. Intercepted communications suggest they believe we've established a significant beachhead on the southern bank, the intelligence officer reported. They're calling for reinforcements from other sectors. This was precisely the strategic outcome the Allied command had hoped for. German forces being pulled away from the areas where actual crossings were occurring. Yet the cost had been high in German lives. Men who had fought and died attacking a position that contained nothing but rubber, canvas, and carefully orchestrated sound. That evening, as Daniel supervised repairs to sections of the bridge damaged by artillery fire, he found himself working alongside Private Jenkins, the former construction worker who had initially questioned the feasibility of their rubber deceptions. "Still think these bridges are just silly props?" Daniel asked, attempting to lighten the mood. Jenkins looked up from the pontoon section he was patching. "No, sir, not anymore. But it feels strange knowing men died today because this looked real to them." Daniel had no ready answer. He had joined the Ghost Army because his skills as a set designer could be useful, because it offered a way to contribute that matched his abilities. He had thought of their deceptions primarily in terms of protecting Allied lives. Each German shell fired at a rubber target meant real soldiers elsewhere were safer. He hadn't fully considered the other side of that equation. "We're still saving lives," he said finally. "More would die if we fought them head-on at every crossing point." Jenkins nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I know that, sir. It's just, they think they're fighting an army, but they're really fighting imagination. Doesn't seem like a fair fight." "War isn't supposed to be fair," Daniel replied, repeating what he had heard countless times from military commanders, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. As they worked through the night, the philosophical questions raised by their mission continued to haunt Daniel. The Ghost Army existed at the intersection of art and warfare, using creativity not to enlighten or entertain, but to deceive and destroy. Their rubber bridges had become weapons as surely as any tank or artillery piece, yet they operated according to principles more commonly found in theaters than on battlefields. By the third day, German forces in the sector had been significantly depleted. Artillery fire directed at the Phantom Bridge became sporadic, and aerial reconnaissance reported that armor and infantry units had been withdrawn from neighboring areas to reinforce what the Germans believed to be a major Allied crossing point. Meanwhile, 17 miles downstream, real American engineers had successfully established actual bridges across the Seine, allowing a genuine armored division to cross unopposed, the defenders having been drawn away by the Ghost Army's elaborate performance. Colonel Simmons gathered the officers for a brief update as the operation entered its final phase. "Headquarters is calling this an unqualified success," he announced. "Our real forces have crossed with minimal casualties, and the Germans remain convinced this is our main effort. In approximately 6 hours, we'll begin the withdrawal process." The Phantom Bridge will appear to have been damaged beyond repair by their artillery, and will simulate a retreat. The final act of the deception would require the same attention to detail as its establishment. The bridge would be partially deflated in strategic sections, creating the impression of critical structural damage. Sound effects would shift to simulate the chaos of a forced withdrawal. Radio traffic would suggest an orderly retreat under fire. As the Ghost Army prepared for this last phase, Daniel found himself standing with Captain Wesley on a small rise overlooking the river and their creation. The rubber bridge stretched across the water, still maintaining its illusion of military purpose despite numerous repairs. From this distance, even knowing its true nature, it was difficult to discern that it wasn't a genuine pontoon crossing. "We've changed how wars will be fought," Wesley said quietly. "After this, deception won't be a sideshow. It'll be central to military planning. Every major operation will include elements like ours." Daniel considered this. "You think there will be more rubber bridges in future conflicts?" Maybe not rubber specifically, Wesley replied with a slight smile. Technology will advance, but the principle, making the enemy see what isn't there, believe what isn't true, that's proven its worth beyond any doubt. As they spoke, a German artillery shell exploded in the water near the center of the bridge, sending spray high into the air. It was a final, futile attempt to destroy a crossing that had never actually existed in any meaningful sense. The irony was not lost on either man. Strange to think, Daniel said, watching as repair teams rushed to maintain the illusion for these final hours, that bridge exists only in the minds of the Germans looking at it from across the river. For them, it's real, filled with American troops and tanks, a genuine threat requiring a genuine response. For us, it's just rubber and air. Reality, Wesley observed, is largely a matter of perspective. 6 hours later, as planned, the Ghost Army began simulating the destruction and abandonment of their Phantom Bridge. Carefully controlled explosions suggested critical damage to key sections. The inflatable components were deflated in a sequence designed to mimic structural collapse. Sound effects shifted to portray the chaos of a forced retreat. Shouted orders, vehicle engines revving in panic, occasional bursts of defensive fire. By nightfall, the rubber bridge that had held the attention of an entire German defensive sector for 3 crucial days appeared to have been destroyed and abandoned. In reality, it was being quietly packed into trucks, ready to be deployed elsewhere when needed. The deception had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do, drawing enemy resources away from actual Allied operations, creating confusion in the German command structure, and ultimately saving lives that would have been lost in direct confrontational crossings. As the Ghost Army withdrew under cover of darkness, Daniel took one last look at the Seine, now empty of their creation. Across that river, German commanders were likely congratulating themselves on successfully destroying an American bridgehead, unaware that the real crossing had happened elsewhere, unopposed because of their focus on a bridge made of nothing more substantial than rubber and imagination. The war would continue, with the Ghost Army performing similar deceptions across Europe. Rubber tanks would appear on hillsides where no real armor existed. Phantom artillery batteries would draw enemy fire away from genuine positions. And recordings of troop movements would convince German listening posts that entire divisions were moving through forests that contained only speakers and sound operators. War had entered a new dimension, one where perception could be manipulated as deliberately as territory could be captured, where imagination became a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb. The bridges that looked packed with armor but were actually made of rubber had changed the nature of modern combat in ways that would echo through conflicts for generations to come. In the darkness, as their trucks rolled away from the Seine, Daniel wondered if the German soldiers who had fought so desperately against their deception would ever learn the truth. That they had been defeated not by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by an elaborate theatrical production staged by artists, designers, and craftsmen who had turned the entire front into a grand illusion. Perhaps someday, when the war was over, those who had fired at rubber and died because of canvas would understand that they had participated in something unprecedented, a battle where the most powerful weapons were not those that destroyed bodies, but those that deceived minds.